They do not tell the truth. They lie. They manipulate our history books. The history books are not true. It's a lie. The history books are lying. You need to know that. You must know that. All the forms of popular music, from jazz to hip hop to bebop to soul, you talk about the different dances, from the cakewalk to the jitterbug to the Charleston to breakdancing. All these are forms of black dancing.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
Africa is not our home. Let me let that hang in the atmosphere for a while. I said at this gathering of the masters, Africa is not your home. It's not our home. But I know my roots, and I ain't Kunta Kinte.
This means, in the case of an American Negro, that the Indians were you.
Welcome to the Aboriginal Channel. On this episode, we will explore information that absolutely 100% disproves the transatlantic slave trade, which means not one boat of Africans came to the Americas as slaves. In previous videos, we learned of the institution of white slavery that tells us that the two institutions, white and so-called Africans, could not have coexisted in the Americas at the same time in the same place. It's just not practical. But there is some that will argue it is possible. In the way their common sense works, it tells them that because it was possible, therefore it's true and it happened. So today, we're going to explore the information that makes the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas impossible. We know what makes it impractical. Now we're going to learn what makes it impossible. So I'll be reading from the book right here called Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast, and Italy from 1500 to 1800. Okay, this is another institution of white slavery that took place at the same time as the so-called transatlantic slave trade and has been completely covered up and propagated out of world history so that no one truly knows about the details and in-depth reality of white slaves in North Africa that completely exposes the transatlantic slave trade narrative to be fraudulent. So down here in the description, it says this is a study that digs deeply into this other slavery, the bondage of Europeans by North African Muslims that flourished during the same centuries as the heyday of the transatlantic trade from sub-Saharan Africa to the Americas. Here are explored the actual extent of Barbary Coast slavery, the dynamic relationship between master and slave, and the effects of this slavery on Italy, one of the slave takers' primary targets and victims. So right here, the book says white slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast, and Italy. So let's look at a map. Here's a map of the Barbary Coast. Right here, you have the Mediterranean Sea, and then the Atlantic Ocean right here by the Strait of Gibraltar. Right here is a little red square that gives you an idea of what area the Barbary Coast encompassed. So the Atlantic Ocean was part of the Barbary Coast. So it said they enslaved them in the Mediterranean and the Barbary Coast, which includes the North Atlantic Ocean. As a short view right here, I'm saying that the information that I'm about to read from out of the book exposes the fact that Europeans could not go into sub-Saharan Africa to transport Africans from Africa to the Americas. They just could not do it. It was impossible based upon the Barbary slave trade, which they don't talk about, and they dressed it up to seem like it's something else. But we're going to go into the book. Here's a page from that book that explains the cause of white slavery in North Africa. But listen to what it says about it. It says the cause, at least in part, can be traced to the events of 1492. In August of that year, Christopher Columbus set sail to find the New World for Europe, and in doing so, put in motion all the mechanisms of conquest and extractive exploitation that would eventually give rise to the sprawling system of plantation slavery in both American continents. Less than 2 months earlier, however, now understand the timeline, Christopher Columbus did not leave from Spain before the Spanish kicked out the Muslims and Moors from Spain in 1492. No. He left 2 months after that happened. So 2 months prior to Christopher Columbus setting sail, The final Spanish conquest of Granada had also set the stage for what would be the mirror image of this American institution. Now, the mirror image, now we're talking about white people on the slave plantations in both American continents. That's what we're talking about, because we've already looked at that in other videos. So right here, he's saying that the final Spanish conquest of Granada, when they kicked out Moors and Muslims and some Jews, he said it set the stage for what would be the mirror image of this American institution. Now, in order for it to be the mirror image of this American institution, the people would have to be white. It goes on to say, by expelling the Moors from southern Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella created an implacable enemy for their resurgent kingdom, one that would find a new home very nearby in Morocco, Algiers, and eventually along the entire Maghreb. The newly reinvigorated Islamic societies they helped to create there soon set out, consciously and passionately, to square accounts with Christendom, building galleys, attacking European merchant shipping, raiding coastal communities, and taking slaves. So right there in 1492, the Islamic societies began consciously and passionately attacking European merchant shipping and raiding coastal communities and taking slaves. So in 1493, the Pope wrote the papal bull and gave not only Ferdinand and Isabella permission, but also numerous other European nations, including France and Britain, to come to the West and take land from anybody who wasn't a Christian. So the 1492 episode in Granada kicked off the white slave trade in North Africa and the Barbary coast. Now here's a passage from that book that talks about most of, or at least half of, the slavers on the ships were renegade Europeans enslaving their own kind. But it also talks about how hellish Negroes were actually punishing the white slaves, which is the exact thing that happened in the Americas. Not only were the slaves white, they were being policed by the Aboriginal people there. So right here it says, the chances were that their master was a renegade, as white and European as themselves. These slaves in Barbary could find little solace in racial explanations for their condition. If anything, they might have to confront a strikingly inverted form of racial oppression, as Francis Brooks detailed in his rather lurid and best-selling tale of his enslavement in Morocco, a story that fairly crawls with the picture of black taskmasters lording it up over white slaves at hard labor. He described it as, the poor Christians were grievously hurried and punished by those hellish Negroes, and had scarce any time to take any nourishment or eat any of their bad bread that was allowed them, but with a great many threats, stripes, and blows by the Negroes, bidding them tum Moors. So they were getting beaten and getting whooped by so-called Negroes, just like in America. That's why when he said the mirror image, that's what he mean. It was the same thing going on over there as it was in the Americas. But at the same time, the book that I'm reading from right now does not speak on white slavery in America. It gives you the illusion that the slavery in America was so-called Africans. But the books always tell on themselves. Here's another example in the book that explains how white people from Europe were enslaving their own kind, not only in the Americas, but also in North Africa. It says, there was also an elite, highly influential stratum of renegades throughout the century between 1580 to 1680. Again, particularly in Algiers. Lists of the concierge Rais from this period make it clear that more than half of these pirate captains were of European origin, men who came to hold considerable economic sway in cities that were dependent on piracy for their well-being. So these white pirates were selling these white slaves to these Muslims. It says their wealth and power made many of them dominant figures in the local culture. The slipshod, though often ferocious, Islam they practiced and the bastardized lingua franca they spoke to their fellow citizens had an enduring impact on the unique Creole communities that developed and flourished for several centuries in the Maghreb. So they were over there making Creole communities, but also selling white folks into slavery. This clip from the book gives an idea of where the white slaves were being enslaved and where they were being held at. So right here it says the primary point of fracture, at least in the 16th and 17th centuries, was evidently religion. though this point may have been exaggerated by the Catholic priests and missionaries whose writings are a major source on social life in the Bagnos, or the plantations. In Algiers and Tunis, Catholics were generally in the majority. Now let's pause for a second and look at what that is. So Catholics were basically the French and the Spanish slaves, and they were held at plantations in Algiers and Tunis. Let's look at the map and see what that is. So right here you have Algiers and Tunis, which is directly across from Spain and France, as you see right here on the map. Algiers, Tunis, France, Spain, which are Catholic. Goes on to say, while the cities of Morocco might have had more British and Dutch. So let's look back at the map. Right here at Morocco and on the Atlantic, these Moors and Muslims right here, on their plantations, you could find the majority of British and Dutch. And the reason why that was because the waterways, this is where they were getting their slave from, over here. These Algerian and Tunis were invading all the waters over here and pirating and taking slaves from over here. Goes on to say that, and Tripoli was at least occasionally reported crowded with large numbers of Greek slaves. Now let's go back to the map. Tripoli had majority Greek slaves, and right here you can see that Tripoli is right next to Greece. So even though I'm sure they all pirated on the Atlantic Ocean. Now, right here from the book, it's talking about the ships that they took. And because they didn't record, the Muslims didn't record how many slaves they were taking from each ship, they calculated by how many people were possibly on the ship and then multiply that by how many ships there were. So right here it says, the concierge captured Christian ships in enormous numbers, for example, and this was a matter of sufficient importance to merchants and insurers to generate much suggestive data. One reads in a variety of contemporary sources, for example, that between November 1593 and August 1594, the Tunisian concierge brought in around 28 prizes with 1,722 captives. Prizes mean ships. That between 1628 and 1634, the Algerians captured 80 merchant vessels from the French alone, taking 986 captives in the process. While between 1628 and 1642, they took 131 ships and barks from the English, totaling 2,555 of His Majesty's subjects. That the rovers of Tripoli, along running one of the similar slaving operations, succeeded in bringing in 75 Christian ships with 1,085 captives between 1677 and 1685. Such accounts are by nature hugely incomplete. For the most part, we have no prize or slave registers in the cities of Barbary beyond sporadic consular records. Other accounts list the number of ships taken in a specific period but omit a count of the captives. Yet these too are suggestive in some very large numbers. Britain's Royal Navy admitted losing 466 English and Scottish ships to Algerian corsairs between 1606 and 1609. The Trinitarian father Pierre Dan claimed that England and Spain between 1613 and 1621 claimed that these same rovers seized 936 vessels from France, Holland, Germany, England, and Spain between 1613 and 1621. While John Morgan wrote, ships and vessels belonging to subjects of these British realms, which the Algerians had taken or destroyed between July and October of 1680. So they were doing land raids and pirating the oceans by England, Scotland, Spain, Germany, Holland, France. Right here it says these pirates also sail by the dozen up the channel and even into the Thames estuary, plundering local shipping in coastal towns, such that, as the minutes of Parliament put it, the fishermen are afraid to put to sea, and we are forced to keep continual watches on all our coasts. Though the raids on the British Isles themselves may have dropped off by the later 1600s, the capture of British ships continued. The Algerians were said to have taken no fewer than 353 British ships between 1672 and 1682, which would mean they were still picking up between 290 and 430 new British slaves every year. Now, let's go and look at where the British Isles are on the map. The British Isles is right here, the British Isles. There's some more little islands right outside of here, and then you have Iceland, Greenland, and then down over here, Newfoundland, and then New England. And that's the route that I presume was always taken by Europeans to get from Europe to the Americas. It wasn't across the Atlantic. It was right here. They say the water around Iceland never freezes because the southern current does not allow the water to freeze right here. So they could travel possibly year round on this route right here. But the British Isles is way up here where they were doing coastal raids and town raids from the late 1500s until the 1800s, which would mean all of this water right here in the Atlantic Ocean was cut off, and they could not go into sub-Saharan Africa to get any slaves. Now, right here, the book gives us some numbers. It's talking about the 50 years in between 1530 and 1580. It says, assuming that the attrition rate among slaves in the 16th century was no lower than in the 17th century, deaths by plague may have been less, but in recompense, there were a number of large-scale adjurations among captive Christians. The Algerian Reis probably brought in as many as 300,000 European slaves in these 50 years. So comparing that to the white slavery of America, where they said over the course of 150 years, 300,000 white slaves were brought. Well, right here, it's saying that the Muslims brought in 300,000 European slaves in 50 years. It says the results then is that between 1530 and 1780, there were almost certainly 1 million and quite possibly as many as 1.25 million white European Christians enslaved by the Muslims of the Barbary coast. Right here is talking about how if you stayed out at sea when you were captured for a long period, you could likely not survive. It says, just how many came to this end and what their proportion was of the total is unknown, since their bodies were thrown into the sea without the slightest regard. One can only presume that a captive's chance of survival was linked to the time it took to get them back to port. And this could vary considerably. Some narratives reported being taken directly to Algiers or Tunis in brief voyages that lasted no more than a week or two. Others who had been unfortunate enough to have been taken at the beginning of the Corsairs' run, or who, like William Oakley or Nicholas Roberts, had been captured in the Atlantic. So that tells you right there that they were taking them in the Atlantic. Now, peep what it says down here. He says they could expect a trip of several excruciating months, sometimes with stops along the way to sell slaves or acquire new ones. In this regard, the Corsair slavers resembled their European counterparts, said to spend weeks sailing along the African coast from barracoon to barracoon until a quota was reached. Now, how could the Muslims be taking all white folks as slaves and taking their ships, but allowing some white slavers to sail along the Atlantic coast? This is the lies these books tell, and they have to do this because they have fear in their heart they'll end up like Bill Cooper. Right here, it exposes how the Muslim slavers enslaved people from Iceland. It says, thus, Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary of meeting British slaves just returned from Algiers and of hearing their stories. At about the same time, the Icelanders were composing sagas about their people's sufferings as slaves in Algiers during the 1630s. Let's go to the map. So right here is Iceland. Muslims from this area were going into Portugal, into Spain, France, and the British Isles, taking people. And they also were going to Iceland, which is an indicator of the route that these Europeans were taking to get from over here to the Americas. Now, in the 1630s, when they said the Icelanders were being taken, the Europeans in Europe were busy enslaving their own people to the Americas, which is probably how Muslims even got to Iceland in the first place, because they were following white slave ships to the Americas. Right here, it's explaining that thousands of white folks were enslaved. It says the question that Francis Knight asked here, how many thousands, was no doubt a heartfelt one. He himself had been enslaved in Algiers and on the Algerian galleys for 7 years and had seen his share of suffering. It also provides a good indication that for the sailors and merchants of his day, enslavement was not something that white Europeans did to other peoples, to Black Africans in particular. Okay? Other peoples means anyone that wasn't white. So it says enslavement was not something that white Europeans did to other peoples, to black Africans in particular. Even the English, though remote from Barbary and themselves already among the more aggressive slave runners in the 1630s. Now, if they're aggressive slave runners in the 1630s, but they didn't enslave black Africans, that meant they were enslaving their own people. And we know that they were taking hundreds by 1619. So that's what they're talking about right there. It says, even the English, though remote from Barbary and themselves already among the more aggressive slave runners in the 1630s, were enslaved by Muslim corsairs operating out of Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco, and in numbers that were not inconsiderable. So in a previous video, we talked about how after the 13 colonies became the United States after the Revolutionary War, how in the written word of the Constitution, white slavery was upheld. So that would mean that slave shipments and slave ships from Europe to the Americas continued after the 1780s. So right here is talking about how the ransoming of white slaves in North Africa became popular. It says, at the very least, such willingness to pay might simply encourage slaveholders to increase their asking prices. When by the late 17th century, more money did indeed become available and more slaves could be ransomed through charitable activity. This is precisely what happened. And by 1700, there is the clear beginning of an inflation spiral that will lead to ransoms more than doubling by the 1760s. Moreover, nations that let it be known that they were disposed to buy back their enslaved citizens more or less promptly ran the further risk of making prime targets out of their own ships and citizens, as the United States would find to its immense cost in the 1790s. So Moors also took ships from the United States and enslaved whites from the 13 so-called states. In the previous video, we talked about things that were written in the book White Cargo. So right here it's talking about the slaves in Europe and the need to get rid of them. It says, it warned that unless somewhere far away was found for the swarms of the lewd and idle, more prisons would have to be built. One recurring proposal to rid the land of convicts was to exchange them with the Christian galley slaves held by the Turkish or North African corsairs. At the beginning of the book, in the acknowledgments of Christian slaves and white masters, it says that the two institutions were mirror images of each other. Now, right here is where it explains the cover-up. Like the other books talked about how mainstream history has covered it up. Well, it says that also right here. It says, such an approach to the question, which finds its sources primarily in the writings of Atlantic slave runners and American plantation owners, and with whom it was widely popular, sets out to prove what it already assumes. However, that slaves in the early modern world were by definition black Africans by origin. So dominant is the assumption in the literature that slaves must have been black that several recent studies proposing to deal with the era's other slavery make no mention at all of the Barbary coast, but instead treat the enslavement of sub-Saharan blacks by Arabs. So basically, what he's saying that in world history, instead of telling the truth about white slavery in North Africa, they choose only to talk about how the Arabs enslaved sub-Saharan blacks. Just like in the Americas, they choose only to talk about the so-called enslavement of Africans to the Americas. But there's no way that could have been possible because you had to go through waters full of Muslim pirates to get African slaves. And why would you risk such a movement when you had your own population that you were already enslaving? There would have been no purpose to even go to Africa. One, because of the risk, and two, because they already had the slaves they needed to do what they were doing in the Americas. And when they didn't, the book says they would buy white slaves back from Indians.
Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's